Well, if one were to read the recipients of the Public Interest Journalism Fund and their coverage of politics and the country over the weekend, one might be surprised to think that the sun has even risen this morning. The pearl-clutching and the absolute outrage at what this terrible new fascist coalition government doing permeates mainstream media. They had to go to the Prime Minister of Palau, I think it was, over the weekend to find someone to criticise our climate policies. Just to remind you, Palau has the population of Levin, maybe a little less. They have found every expert, left-wing expert that they used to go to say this is terrible, the smoke-free stuff is terrible, and really the government's in big trouble because Winston Peters says the media are bent, and the media have spent a lot of time saying, no, we're not. Maddie McLean, how are you this morning? As I said, you read the coverage, you'd think the country was on the brink of civil war. The Māori are revolting. The Māori Party says there's going to be uprising. Ian Taylor has thrown his toys out of the cot. Just why, I don't know, and we've invited him on to talk about that. We are not interested, apparently, in having a drunk mayor running Wellington. It is all about Chris Bishop not knowing how many ciggy shops there are in Northland, and that is the end of the world. Or is it? Because it would seem to me that the rest of us seem all right and we're getting on with life. So what has this tumultuous week that's led to a country on the brink of disintegration, what's really happened? I thought we'd talk to our favourite political commentator, Chris Trotter. Chris, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Sean.
I hope you were chuckling at my incredibly passionless summary of the last week. It is remarkable, isn't it, how terrible this government is. Just how many laws they might have broken.
Well, to hear the mainstream news media tell the story, you would indeed feel rather shaken and stirred by what is being described. It is salutary, actually, to see just how deeply embedded the support, not just for the Labour government, and I think, you could make an argument, a reasonable argument, that the news media was critical of the Labour government, as it should be, as is its role in a democratic society. But it's not so much that as the news media's deeply, deeply embedded support for the ideas that drove that
catastrophic man-made climate change, gender identity or gender fluidity, Māori sovereignty, and certain interpretation.
All of those things. The whole, what some people describe as the whole woke agenda. It is fascinating to see, now that the people of New Zealand have emphatically rejected the woke agenda, just how unwilling so many mainstream journalists are to accept that their version of reality has been rejected, that a government has been elected that looks at the world through a set of very different lenses, and just to take a deep breath and move on into that new political reality. We're not seeing that. We're seeing this desperate rearguard action by so many journalists fighting on. Even though the battle flag of the enemy has been
Napoleon is already in the coach
fort
on the way back to Paris, right? The Imperial Guard is turn and run. But they're like
indeed,
that last square.
La garde recule, the guard retreats, that's right.
Yeah. Look, the other amazing thing, and I think it is worth noting, Television New Zealand in particular appears to be in almost full revolt against the government. They have started running a quiz each week on how many of the te reo words we use do you recognise? And they have increased the use of Māori language in their weather bulletins to the point where they are almost entirely in Māori. And I'm sorry, Chris, I cannot see that as anything but a massive middle finger to the incoming government.
Well, yes, and all around the Western world, Sean, there are instances of what I call, the mutiny of the younger generation of journalists, and it began quite a few years ago now, in such august institutions as the New York Times, when I think it was under Trump, somebody wrote something. And he was a Republican senator or congressman, I think, and his opinion piece was run by the New York Times, and all the young journalists demanded that the person who had allowed it to be run be sacked.
Yeah,
and the editors blushed their eyes, capitulated, and sacked the guy for the sin of allowing a different viewpoint to be published on the pages of the New York Times.
Yeah.
And this was perhaps the most dramatic example of this phenomenon, but it has been going on ever since all around the Western world. And I was talking to a former newspaper editor just the other day. We were talking about the decline in journalistic standards. I put forward the idea, why don't we get a really strong oversight body? I know, former newspaper editors bridle at the idea, but one that absolutely insisted on accuracy, balance, and fairness, and intervened decisively whenever those principles were abrogated. And unlike the Media Council and the BSA, ceased to come up with all kinds of weird fudges like, you can achieve balance over time.